Good evening. Welcome to the Clergy Roundtable of the Naples United Church of Christ here in beautiful Naples, Florida. This is the last session of our study together of the book, Love is the Way, Holding On to Hope in Troubling Times by Bishop Michael Curry, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. My name is Sharon Harris Ewing, and I have the privilege of serving as the assistant minister here. I'm joined by my friends and colleagues, the Reverend Dr. Dawson Taylor, who is the senior minister, and Reverend Dr. Deb Kaiser-Cross, who is the minister for congregational care for, I think, 11 more days.
You know
Oh, so
better than
you
I
started
do.
a countdown too.
So I just want to say thank you to Deb for
Yeah.
her leadership of Clergy Roundtable sessions and her insights when others are leading. We will miss you. It won't be the same.
I will miss you. This is one of my favorite things. I
know.
love doing this.
I was thinking about that today, just about the poignancy of tonight, but also I was thinking back about some of our first ones when we sat in uncomfortable straight back chairs with no anything different, and then how far it's come, but also just the journey together in that.
And it happens serendipitously.
Right, I know, it really,
It's one of those things, the two things that happened from the pandemic that turned out to be amazingly wonderful were the Clergy Roundtable,
Yeah.
because we had to do it in a different format,
Right.
and the Going the Distance,
I know.
that I feel like those were two things that were meaningful to us and meaningful to the congregation. And
And interestingly, just as we look forward, I think it will also be a really great way for new clergy colleagues when we greet them and welcome them, for us to get to know them and for the congregation to get to know them. Just as, I'm sure we've learned things about each other, but I think people have begun to see that we really do work so closely together and work so well together. But, I think it would be a great way for the congregation to get to know new colleagues when we sit together as they arrive as well. So I think that's a great gift that both of those offer.
Yeah.
It's a great way to kind of know the more personal side.
And I will also say that, when you're not the primary preacher, like those of us in the associate
Right,
role,
right.
people don't often get to know us in quite the same way. And
Right.
so this is one more way that people can feel like they're connected to the clergy in the congregation.
Right, exactly. And again, I think reflecting the team model, that we all have our different roles. And so like you say, when you're not the primary preacher, the primary voice, I think that is an important part of that.
Well, it's interesting as I think about that, part of what has contributed to the richness of our conversation is our diverse backgrounds.
Exactly.
And that when we bring Angela, she will be the first clergy person among this group who grew up as a UCC and has always been a UCC person.
You and I can sit there and go, tell us what it's like. Exactly.
So, but yes.
No, I appreciate that. That is an important point. And actually, I think that's one of the things, not that I speak for them, but I think that was something. I'm actually having dinner tonight after this with a member of that search committee, and I will ask them. But I think that's one of the things that drew the search committee to her, among her many talents. But the fact that she does come not only from, she is a dual preacher's kid, like Deb and David's kids, but, she is rooted in the United Church of Christ. And again, that is a richness that she will bring in a different angle that I think will be celebrated, is celebrated.
She also adds a little age diversity, all kinds of other things.
Okay, I just want to go on record. She's 9 years younger. It's so funny
She's
though.
a lot younger than I am.
Well, okay, but it's so funny though. I'm finally getting fed what I've dished out for so long, where I am no longer the young person on staff, and it's hilarious to watch my own response to it, because I was laughing when the search committee identified Angela, and they were like, finally a clergy person that's young and brings energy and passion to the job. And I was like, excuse me? So it's great. But no, actually, I emailed with Angela a little bit earlier today, and they are excited about looking southward. So
Yes. Well, Thank you to the production team. Alex and Jay, I think today,
Yeah.
are the one we can see, one we can't. To Wendy, who sets us all up like this. And thank you to our viewers. You have given us lots of feedback over the last 13, 14 months. And we appreciate your watching and your sharing your responses with us. Dawson and I are in conversation about what comes next, so all I can say is stay tuned. We're still talking about it.
Yeah, just to tease it a little bit, I think what we've talked about is something for this fall, again, once Angela arrives, so that's not until September. I think we should offer that some of our colleagues on the staff suggested that we do like a summer beach read and just, sit on the beach and do this. And I said, why not? But no, we've talked about perhaps if we can figure out some model for the summer, but as we've been very transparent, and with Deb retiring and being already down one clergy position and Angela not arriving until September, we're going to have our plates pretty full this summer, and then perhaps something this fall. But so this is kind of a little bit of a closure for the time being, but we do have plans to return this fall.
Absolutely, absolutely. So stay tuned. Any other announcements, Dawson?
I think just we want to invite people to worship on Sunday for Pentecost Sunday. Wear red. And then I think probably the most exciting announcement is that we will be, we will have fellowship time returning. And so after the 9 and 11 o'clock services, we'll be gathering in the gathering place for people to visit, and as different clergy feel comfortable, we'll be out there visiting with people and things like that. So we'll look forward to that.
Yeah. As many people have commented, it's been good to see people in person.
Oh.
I do have to tell you, because this just floored me when I realized we had a meeting of the Justice Committee at 1:30 this afternoon, and people were saying how good it was to see each other in person, and we realized the first official meeting of that group was in April of last year, so every meeting has been via Zoom.
So that is the first time
we have met in
committee
person.
Wow.
has met in person. That is amazing.
It was very amazing, and it was great meeting.
I bet that
So,
was. Wow,
All
that
right.
is remarkable.
Tonight's discussion of Love is the Way will focus on chapters 11 and 12 with just some brief attention to the suggestions that Curry gives in the appendix. And at the end, we'll try to pull it all together and think about the most important messages from the book. So chapter 11 is entitled The Still More Excellent Way, and as most of the chapters, has a question: does love mean avoiding politics? So Curry begins this chapter by discussing a group that he helped to form called Reclaiming Jesus Elders. Curry voiced a concern about how, and I quote here, extremists are drowning out the silent majority, and those extremists are using religion to defend a panoply of dark isms: racism, nationalism, nativism, sexism, and on and on. Their views don't represent the views of most Christians, but they are aggressively promoting them to the point of crisis for the church. So before we discuss his response and the groups like Reclaiming Jesus Elders, I want to ask both of you, do you agree with Curry's assessment of the problem? He wrote this and was describing the situation a few years ago. Would you say the problem has gotten better, worse, or changed in any way from what he described?
Well, I will say, I'm not sure it's worse. It just is much more in our face. We've had the time in this pandemic. We've been home. We've seen more social media. We've seen more TV. We've seen more cable news. And so I think it's been in our face more. So there's that piece of it. But he really made me remember. He talked about silent majority here, but he used another term that was much more intriguing to me, and that was the silent center, is that the great majority of people are not at the extremes. They really aren't. And that the great majority of the people I know aren't at the extremes, and that they're reasonable people who may have different stories and different opinions, but it's possible to have a conversation with them. However, the media has made us think, or at least, I shouldn't say, nobody can make you think things, but has pushed us to think that those conversations aren't reasonable and they're not possible. And so I was encouraged by him. And the last thing I'm going to say about it that was in this section that I loved, his line was, if all decent people sit this out, as in don't deal with it, we are handing our country and our future over to extremists. And that was convicting and inspiring at the same time for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me interestingly is almost all the same points that Deb raises, except, or in addition to, how you could put the word church in for all the same things, and how so many situations in churches are impacted by these same ideas. So I have watched churches almost destroy themselves by vocal minority on the extreme, in the extremes. Yes. That it's the silent center, because again, I liked his word, but often it's the silent center who are holding the church together or attempting to hold that center, I would call it sacred center, and not able to do so because so much power is given to a vocal minority who rest at the extremes. And so I was so struck by his language about our nation, but how that so often is applicable to the church. I had a less optimistic view, which is not often my MO, and it feels like we're in a worse place than when he originally wrote. But I think, Deb, you raised such an important point, and that is, are we at a worse place, or have I just been watching too much TV over the last 13, 14 months, having been home much more, especially in the evenings, than I typically am? And so I think that's something for me to think about, because I thought, it's just not like me to think in a pessimistic way.
Well, I would say the same about myself, but I had the same response. I do think that there are ways in which it's worse. And certainly the us versus them mentality. And the thing that struck me, and I've probably said this before, but in terms of the extremes talking to each other and learning from that silent center, it seems to me to really engage in meaningful dialogue, there has to be some foundational agreement. And I think that's part of what the church offers. There are things we agree on. But we've reached a point right now where we don't even agree about what the facts are. And so it's really hard to talk about the situation we're in if we don't even think that we don't have the same set of facts.
Okay, so my question is, what if we stop focusing on the extremes and look for the people in the silent center who might disagree with each other? Because I don't think there is much chance, this is where I am pessimistic, of convincing people in the extremes.
Right.
I just don't think that's possible. But I do think the silent center people,
Right.
if they're a little bit more in that bell curve in the middle, we can have conversations. And I think that's the church.
Well, I was
for
going
the
to say,
most
and
part.
again, when I've seen churches have real problems is when the energy is focused,
Yeah.
as we've talked about before, that which you give energy to is what grows. When churches give energy, focus, and attention on those vocal minorities at the extremes is when there's problems. And so why wouldn't it be the same for our nation, our political parties, the Rotary Club? I mean, whatever it is. And so, I think that's an important point, Deb, is that when we pay attention and focus on these vocal extremes on the outer fringes or edges, of course that creates further divisiveness.
And then we just give up. We
Right.
just say,
Yeah.
I can't do
Yeah,
anything,
it's out of my
nothing's gonna
control and
change.
nothing's going to change.
But if I've learned nothing else from this book and a lot of things during this pandemic is that I've got people I disagree with on this who see it differently. But when I've been able to engage with curiosity and compassion and humility, I've had some interesting conversations. Will we agree? No, but we see each other as human beings and we don't create an it out of each other.
Right. It's not relationship ending disagreement.
Right.
And to me, that's what extremism does. It's relationship ending disagreements, and extremism is what what happens there.
And I want to lift up what you read, Deb, because I think he does make a very good point that we don't have the option of sitting out.
If we sit out, it will get worse.
Right. So the Reclaiming Jesus movement calls upon churches to go back to the roots of their faith and reject the politics of white supremacy, racism, misogyny, and the oppression or dehumanization of anyone. It also sought a, quote, peaceful, loving means to reach a peaceful, loving end. So, what would you say are those core values, the roots of our faith, that might enable or empower us to overcome this divisiveness? Can't talk tonight. This divisiveness. And what are some of the peaceful, loving means that are ours because we are the church?
Well, to me, this is where progressive theology, and not to say that it's like an us, them, or who can win, but I think this is where progressive theology has the upper hand. And this is why I have so much optimism and hope about progressive theology in the United Church of Christ looking to the future, because we are a big tent denomination and church. We are a place that says everyone is welcome here, even if it makes us uncomfortable at times. And uncomfortable is a broad definition, right? I mean, it can be those who push me to believe in a more progressive political way or theological way or a more conservative way, or, things like that. And so I believe that when they talk about the Reclaiming Jesus movement, I mean, if you think about it, those are pretty core values and foundational beliefs to who we are as a congregation. And I mean, if you're pro-misogyny, you're going to be uncomfortable at Naples United Church of Christ. And I'm not apologetic about that. Right. And so, those are the kind of values that who we are as a congregation and who we are as a church. And so I think, again, this is where the optimism of the hope and future of our denomination and our church specifically, as I look to the future.
I answer it a little bit differently. I agree with what you have to say, because I actually think the UCC is a denomination for millennials, because we espouse the kinds of things that millennials and younger appreciate. So, but when I think about what he did with Reclaiming Jesus Elders, I think about the fact that he was trying to model what he believed Jesus would have modeled, the way of life in our culture. And it's not what would Jesus do, it's just what kind of way of life and what kind of attitude would he have had. And so I was trying to pick out the things that I think he was lifting up, and one was to focus on the golden rule: do unto others what you'd have them do unto you. Try to get to a place where you can find common ground and have a conversation, and to get to a place where you can find shared values and priorities, even if we can't agree on the outcome. And then finally, really listen to their stories, because that's what Jesus did so well. He saw people's lives, he listened to their stories, and then he responded because he understood who they were and why they were doing what they did. And so that's, for me, what I think they were trying to personify and embody in the elders group. So.
And this is an example of how this is not even that we disagree, but we bring a different lens to the conversation. I'm thinking, okay, core values. So I'm thinking about things like the fundamental affirmation that every single human being is made in the image of God, is a beloved child of God. And so I don't, just like I don't have the option of opting out, I don't have the option of writing off half of the population or a third of the population, that I have to figure out, well, how do I see the image of God in that person with whom I disagree so strongly? And I thought about, in terms of the church, that we don't live into the fullness of what we believe and preach, but there is something foundational about believing that we are one in Christ, and that there's a unity there that we have to find and live into, but it is a unity. And then on a very different kind of angle, I guess, I also think when it comes to talking about politics and those other things that he deals with in this chapter, we do have, again, we don't live it the way I wish we did, but we have a faith that says our allegiance to Christ should be greater than the allegiance to any nation. And, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And so to say, no, we don't worship any human being, we worship only God. And I think that's a springboard that we can work from as well. And picking up on the church and things that both of you said, Curry points out that his church, like ours, has members from across the political spectrum. So I'm just curious, how do you see having a diverse congregation as a strength, and perhaps also as a challenge as we try to figure out how to live together in a better way in this nation?
It makes me tired. I'm just going to be really honest. I'm tired of the balancing act. I just wish we could listen to each other and not be so on edge. I feel like we're always walking on eggshells with politics. And so I wish we could go back to remembering that when we're speaking from the pulpit, we're trying to reflect what we believe God has said through God's people who wrote it. And we're not espousing a political perspective. We're trying to be faithful to the call that God has put upon our lives. And so I wish people would have generous assumptions about us preaching, honestly, that we are not trying to beat people over the head over what we think politically. We really aren't. We're trying to lift up the values of Jesus. So that's one. I'm tired. Can you tell? But the second piece is that the Protestant tradition has so lifted up the Word of God that we put preaching at such a high level, and that preaching is one-sided. I wish that every week that we would have a sermon and we would be able to have a conversation about it, because then people could hear each other's perspectives if they chose to. But we tend to be, we speak to and people receive, and then they go home at the dinner table and talk about it. But wouldn't it be lovely if we could talk about it together? Okay, I'm off my soapbox now.
No, amen, let's take the offering and go home. I think about the reality of it would be, so church would be easier if it was, monochromatic in the sense of belief, and I've never had the privilege of serving a church where everyone believed the same. I think I watch churches on television sometimes where it seems like everybody believes the same, or at least espouses that. And I do. I think there's a temptation to that, especially for pastors, right? Because it would be, I think, easier. I can't speak to it from experience, but it sure seems it. Because the tension of holding that together, I think I think people rarely realize how intensely stressful and draining it truly is.
That's
I mean,
the
I just,
exhaustion factor.
yeah, it is. I mean, and we've talked about this some, and you know, and we've talked about this openly that Deb had indicated that she would retire sometime this year. So this isn't a comment about her, but the number of clergy retirement, there is a wave happening that we're seeing nationally, and we know of colleagues that we've talked about that we're surprised by, but part of it is undoubtedly that something like the COVID crisis that we've lived through for the last 13 months, it is people are bringing all of their politically charged beliefs about a health crisis to the church. And so it feels like every time you open your mouth, it's a gotcha moment. And so again, Deb reminding us about generous assumptions, you know, those more generous assumptions at times would be appreciated. I think the only thing I would add to what Deb said about that is, you know, I'd like to remind us about political versus partisan. Because as I like to say, Jesus was political, and that makes us uncomfortable, and I understand that. Jesus was not partisan. So I can say, I have never made a partisan statement in the pulpit, nor do I ever plan to or want to. I have made political statements in the pulpit. I don't try to make a habit of it, but and I don't try to be intentionally political. People again have their antennae up about it, but there is a distinct difference about where we are called to act, which I believe is about being political. It's not about being partisan. And so that is a real challenge. And that I think there's a spiritual maturity to that. It takes a long time to kind of get that clear in our minds. And I've been grappling with it for a long time as well.
On the flip side, the potential benefit that we've talked often about is the fact that there are diverse perspectives allows you the opportunity to try to bring people together to talk and to listen and to create that safe space. I mean, we've talked about you can't create cultural or ethnic or racial diversity, but we do have diversity of thought.
Right,
And
so
we can use that to engage each other.
yeah, so I believe that diversity reflects the realm of God.
Absolutely.
So churches that are truly monochromatic in every sense of the word, I don't believe reflect fully who God is asking them to be. And so if I find myself at some point serving a church where everyone agrees, I will probably move on because it means I've created something in my image and not God's image. And so I think that would be really dangerous. And then as much frustration as it can sometimes bring, at the same time, there's such wealth in that diversity because I learn so much and I'm clear that the people around us learn so much, and that, as I've said numerous times, and I think we're all in agreement, I believe the church is the last place in our nation where people of differing opinions can gather and share how they believe and be heard with any hope. Now, it doesn't mean it always happens, but I think this is the last place. This is the last great hope for civility in our nation, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I would agree. And to pick up on what you said about Jesus being political, in the next section, Curry talks about love is the way, so we have to introduce love into political discourse,
Yeah.
which just doesn't sound like it works at all, but he says it does.
Not
and
currently. Sorry.
He insists that Jesus was dangerous. He
Yeah.
was a revolutionary, and he quotes his friend Professor Charles Marsh, who said, Jesus has founded the most revolutionary movement in history, a movement built on the unconditional love of God for the world and the mandate to live that love. So, was Jesus a revolutionary? And what difference does that make?
Yes, I do believe that. And I think because he revolutionized, first of all, our understanding of God, but he also challenged his culture, because every culture seems to lift up money and power as the most valued things. And Jesus said neither of those are really important in the end. They just aren't. And so he challenged it. And so people who had money and power and institutional authority couldn't stand him for obvious reasons, because he challenged their assumptions about what was important in this world. So that's my short version.
Yeah, it got him killed.
Yeah, you think?
I mean, so, you have to wonder, or you have to, in my opinion, you have to believe that he clearly was revolutionary to that point. And then when, what our faith tells us is that when they thought all was gone and lost, he overcame even death. And however you view that, if that's metaphorical for you or literal or whatever that means to your faith life, he was able to overcome even that power and that institution. And so, I think he was revolutionary every time he turned around. And I think it ultimately cost him his life. And so I think one of the great questions that many of us have to grapple with is, what would we give our lives for? And sometimes I don't think it even means our physical lives, but what would we give the power and the wealth and the prestige for? Or perhaps those are things I grapple with. But I'll use an I statement, but those are things I grapple with from time to time.
And when I thought about some of the countercultural aspects of Jesus' message, I thought about things like the role of women, and how, even though there are passages that people have misused about women in the church, fundamentally, Jesus affirmed women in a way that had not happened before. And in a similar way, I mean, his message of liberation has been used by blacks in terms of the civil rights movement, and also certainly the whole challenge to the culture. And I think saying that then raises the question, and I'm not asking for an answer, but I think it's one we have to constantly ponder, is what are the ways that Jesus is trying to change our current culture? I mean, the power and money, but what else? I mean, what are the things that if we really were following in his way, we would be doing differently, because it's not what our culture calls us to do.
Yeah, and I think the flip of that coin is also, I think Jesus lifted people up and celebrated people that the culture pushed to the side. And so I think, so I try as best I can in my ministry among us, but also before being here, is I try to talk about celebrating people, because I just think in our culture, we don't celebrate enough. And so celebrate people enough, but I think Jesus, that was part of his revolution, was to celebrate those who were already being pushed to the side. And that was women, children, slaves, and what Jesus did was not only welcome them, but celebrated them. And so I want to be a part of churches that lift people up and celebrate them, that society is trying to push to the side. And so I think that was part of Jesus' revolution as well.
It makes me just think, in the world of education, when I was teaching and doing school board things, we talked a lot about multicultural education, and what we didn't want, consistent with what you're saying, is just to tolerate people who are different.
Right.
It is to accept and value and affirm and celebrate.
Yeah, because what child comes in and says, please tolerate me? Right. Yeah.
So I'm going to try to summarize some things. Curry says, as we've commented, we have to be involved in politics in some way, and we have to do it differently and not fall into the trap of doing politics as usual with winners and losers and, us and them. We must raise the conversation to a higher level, shift the conversation to higher ground, above and beyond the politics and the issues as the players have defined them. So this is when he talks about the golden rule, which is found, some version of which is found in virtually all religions. And he said, this is interesting to me, to say to lawmakers and advocates, if you are making laws that impact human beings, those laws should pass the test of Jesus' golden rule. And he talks about love doesn't just belong in the public square, it's desperately needed to break through deadlock and make our diversity of perspectives an asset. Again, to celebrate, not just something that we put up with. And he says the path to love needs to look like love, which includes a revival of relationships, building bridges instead of trying to win points, telling stories together. And these themes come up throughout the book. He talks about language and how the candlelight vigil that he led in 2018 was prayer, not protest.
Yeah. I thought that was a really interesting dichotomy that he pointed out.
And there was another word where it was not a protest, but a protecting Jesus.
Well, it was the protecting the water, remember?
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
protecting the water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so he's giving principles and guidelines for how we engage in the political world. What in his ideas did you find most helpful? What was maybe a new insight or something that he said a different way than you had heard before? How do we productively engage?
I think what he helped me remember is that, I do coaching. And in coaching, we're always taught to help people find the third way. Because most of the time, people come into my office or whatever, and
Your Zoom spot.
So-
my Zoom spot, and it could be, and they'll say, well, I either have to do this or this. And my job is to say, well, let's look at both of those things, and is there a third way? And I think that's what Curry is saying, is that we are so caught up in dualism. You're going to either win or lose. And he's trying to help us see that there is a third way, a different way of engaging the topic that is not a zero-sum game. So the third way is mine.
Yeah, and I think he does such a skillful job of reminding us that our faith is not a Sunday morning only experience. And I think for many of us, that can be a challenge. And I don't mean challenge like in a bad way, but just it can be it's an important reminder that our faith is, we are called rather to weave our faith in our values into every aspect of our life. And I think sometimes there is a lack of in some ways a duality, or there is an intense duality, but in the sense that our faith is maybe Sunday and Wednesday, and then life is the rest of the time. And I think he does in some very practical ways remind us that it is about the laws we pass, the checks we write, the decisions we make in our families, and and some just again, it was a good reminder for me as a pastor and as a Christian, and I think it would be for anyone who is reading. I just think he intertwines that in a really skillful way.
And I think when I think about what do we as clergy people need to do, part of it is to communicate that message.
Yeah.
That we're not, Christ in the world, out of the world to transform the Christ in culture.
Yeah.
I'm
Right.
not gonna, but
Neighbor.
yeah,
I know, and I even
Christ
did
in
like
culture.
part of my doctoral work on that. I'm thinking like, oh, great.
But that we live in the world, but we're not of the world.
Of the world, right.
And that we live by a different set of values, and that part of our role is to transform the world, and so we have to be engaged. I mean, I think you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about money, you don't talk about religion, that separation of faith from life that you're talking about, we have to communicate that so that people don't believe and live the stereotype that they're separate.
Yeah, there's a meme, I think we've talked about it as a team before, that I saw that says, I was raised to not talk about politics and religion, and perhaps that's why we're in the situation we're in, because we don't talk about politics and religion.
We don't know how to.
We don't know how to. That's what it was.
Exactly.
That's what it was, is we don't know how
Yeah.
to. And I think that's what it is. It's this intense duality as though the two shall never meet, when actually, again, I think one of the things that Curry does for us, and again, I think we are called to remind people in ourselves to do this better, is how to marry the two in a much healthier, holistic way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And thinking about the golden rule and how he kind of distilled some things into their essence, one of the pieces of that I really appreciated is it's a way in which Christians can join with people of other faiths or no faith to be engaged in the political world and trying to make the conditions in which we live more like God intends, because I do think Christians are absolutely called to be engaged in the world and to be engaged even in politics in a variety of different ways. But what needs to be done is not ours alone. And so the motivation for us may come from our Christian tenets and from Jesus' teaching, but to be able, to use the term Mary, but to bring together those commitments with other faiths, for me, is just a critical piece in the multi-faith world that we live in. And so I thought that was really helpful to me. And
You know, I think there's a really important caveat that I'm just so concerned that when the church decides to be allied so closely with any political party, it's really dangerous. And I think that when we hear from some of our church members don't talk about politics, that's what they don't want.
Right.
They don't want to be told from the pulpit how to vote. They don't want to say you have to be a Republican to be a Christian, you have to be a Democrat to be a Christian. I think we've always got to ask ourselves, how much do we want to ally ourselves with any particular political party or view, because we could easily lose our primary affiliation, which is Christian. And so it's
Right.
one of those I'm just always aware of.
No, exactly. And again, I think for me, that's that line about political versus partisan, because it is not about either of the two main parties in the United States or any other party globally.
isn't.
It is about, or about aligning. It is about being able to critique and call out, frankly, either party or a third party, or, and it is about aligning ourselves with the values
Exactly.
that we understand as people of faith, and our willingness to say this is not in alignment. And that can be, again, about calling out. So to me, that is that very, and to me it's not even a fine line, that very defined line about political versus partisan. Because to me, that's the end of, in my mind, the end of religion and the end of politics.
Well, because what ends up happening is that when you get too involved in politics, it's easy to get seduced by the power.
Sure.
And so I think that I'm just going to say it, I think the religious right has really sold out for power. And that concerns me greatly.
And I think you're right that it's something that can easily be, you can either get sucked in, or people don't understand some of the distinctions. But certainly, I think it's inherent in everything that Curry says, that we're not talking about parties. But his words, how can we productively engage with our democracy and our leadership so that the laws of the land reflect shared human values of compassion, mercy, and care for people and the planet?
Right, because
that's what about
yeah, because to ignore politics as people of faith is to ignore the systems by which we are able to influence and call out and cry out for those who are underprivileged to protect our earth, to protect our resources.
Absolutely.
You know, so it is this, we cannot, you know, so I will say that I push back on those who say, you know, don't speak of politics from the pulpit, or don't, you know, do that, because, you know, I believe that we are commanded to do so, because that in our society today is how we influence on behalf of those who have
The
less than.
important piece is to ask ourselves why we're doing it.
Of course.
If we're doing it because we believe that is the mandate of Jesus, and we can honestly say it's not about our own personal power and prestige, then
Or shock value.
or shock value.
Because I've watched colleagues and friends
Yeah.
who think to themselves, well, I'll show them. And I'm like, oh, sweet Jesus. Really?
But
I
that's,
mean, come on.
and I think
Yeah.
that's the concern
Sure.
I have, is that we've got to look at is my motivation pure in this? It probably isn't all the time, but if I can be honest.
Speak for yourself, Deb.
If
No,
I can
exactly,
be
yeah.
honest about it.
Right.
And say, this is really why I'm doing this, then I think it's
Yeah, and I
right.
think those are the really fair critiques and questions that ought to be asked of any public leader, of any preacher, pastor. And again, as I always say, you should ask those questions, and they should be talked about to any of us. You know, and again, I know I'm the primary preacher, but they should be asked of any of us who preach. But again, with respect and in the right, you know, place and time, and, you know, because as we try to say, preaching is an intimate act. I mean, you are putting yourself and your thoughts and your ideas out there. But I do think it is a very fair question, and it should be asked. Why did you feel the need, or why was it in your mind appropriate or right to say that, and what was driving that? Because that is how I believe many people in ministry get, if you will, out of check, or the ego game, or, you know, things like that.
Exactly.
Because it can be very enticing. But no, I think what you raise is really important. I just would add you know, if you're doing it for the shock value, because again, I've watched people do that, and I think
Yeah.
really, you know.
And that's all about ego anyway.
Well,
And
touche,
so
touche.
power, prestige, shock
Right,
value.
no, you know, and
So-
maybe that was the unnecessary statement, but yeah.
So, shock value, we're running out of time.
Okay.
I am
All right,
shocked.
pick the best
So
stuff
maybe
to
in,
do.
I was going to say, maybe in honor of Deb's, we should have just gone a 2-hour special or something, you know. I don't know.
Or not.
She keeps
So
accusing
chapter
me.
12 is very short. It says hope, help, and healing. And Bishop Curry talks about the time he was flying from Kenya to Burundi, and the Bishop of Colorado, who was sitting behind him, says, look out the window. And they were passing, and he looked out to see the snow-capped peak of Mount Kilimanjaro. And came to his mind the great hymn, How Great Thou Art. And so he goes on and describes mountaintop experiences when human beings encounter the divine and we experience God. On mountaintops, prophets and poets see what the Bible calls a new heaven and a new earth. He goes on and talks about other experiences, some of them just an interaction with a person passing through the line after a worship service, some of them a group of people who have come together and experienced God's presence among them. Love does that. We can't live on the mountaintop, but the mountaintop can live in us. Any examples of mountaintop experiences that you would like to share with viewers?
There have been a lot, but I will say that most of mine have happened in kind of a retreat kind of time where I've taken off from my normal life, and I've gone to a place that has some sacred space to it, a retreat center, that monastery, and set aside everything so that I could be open to God's presence. So one was in LA, one was in Okeechobee, one was in, but many, many places over the years. Often there's an element of silence in it. And so, yeah, those sustain me.
And you have in your notes, and Curry references about how the Celtic people refer to those places as the thin places,
Yeah.
which I love that image. I've always loved that image because being visual, I can envision that thin place between this life and the next. And I would say that those are often the places where I've experienced the real sacred and the real holy, is being alongside someone as they transition from this life to the next. Maybe I'm not there in the very moment that they do it, but just walking that journey because, and Deb can attest to this far more than I can, but I just, there's often this intense honesty and people who are ready to deal with that are often, I have experienced, can often be lighthearted, even in the midst of some difficult challenges ahead, and they often minister to me. And I've spoken about, in these settings, about when I'm tired, I can basically reach the end of my rope and can be difficult to get along with, like any of us. But also, those thin places happen for me often when I'm tired as well, because everything is stripped away.
Yeah.
All the pretense, all the walls, all the barriers, and that's when I can catch myself. And so, as much as I try to not be too tired or worn out, because you don't want to get to that place, sometimes that's when God or those around me do their best work, because I can't put up defenses.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hear you.
I thought of a couple of times in nature, as he talks about with Matt Kilimanjaro, and I've shared before the experience of standing in what felt like a huge earthen bowl at Great Sands National Park, looking up at the Milky Way in the open sky, and certainly a holy moment. But as my mind went to different things, interactions with people, and I don't think I'm the only person, but one of the places for me that I sometimes just feel God's presence in that way is singing hymns.
Mm.
And one of them, which does it to me almost every time, maybe not every time, but is the Here I Am, Lord, that we did
Yeah.
on Mother's Day when we celebrated. And there are just times when I'm swept away in the music and the words. I mean, when they're both really good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
I have been
arts-
known to write things down and say, okay, for my funeral, include this. But
Yeah.
not there yet.
Yeah, the arts do that for me often. Beautiful
Yeah.
music,
Oh, yeah.
obviously here, but having sung in choirs in college and then after college and stuff, I've done that. And then I was just thinking as you were speaking that, I've experienced God in ways that just being around friends and feeling loved and safe and relaxed and. I think I talk about it a lot, but that's why my time in Mexico each spring is fun, because I can just be sitting on a beach and just enjoying doing nothing but staring at a beautiful ocean surrounded by loving friends and enjoying just that moment.
Yeah.
And
The other thing that came to my mind, and I look at Deb because of things that we've done together, but is in small groups. When there's a personal sharing and there's an acceptance and a love that fills the room, and a sense of people feeling like they can be themselves in a way they haven't before.
Yeah.
Those are holy moments
They
as
really
well.
are.
Yeah. So I said it would be brief about the appendix. It's gotten even briefer in terms of the time. But for those of you who have read the book, or if you haven't, want to know more about it, Curry does provide a short appendix where he tries to give tips for creating your own rule of life. And he cites the most famous rule of life, St. Benedict's, which has guided Benedictine monks for 15 centuries, and the way of love, practices for a Jesus-centered life created by the Episcopal Church. And I won't go through everything, but he has tips to get started. Be realistic. You do you. You're not trying to be somebody else. Be loving. Don't turn this into self-regrets and self-criticism. And don't wait. Dive in right away. And he talks about creating your own rule of life and some habits that you want to work on. One of the things that I thought was fascinating, because I haven't seen this in the same way, is he talks about categories for action. So what are we going to do in terms of our bodies, our minds, our spirits, our relationships, in giving back and in the community? And I really like what he ended with. The most essential truth I learned in my own journey is that none of us has the capacity to walk it alone. We need help from the very sources of these principles, from God's love. And we also need soul companions to help us along the way. We need each other. Just your reflections on this summary, this rule, this way of creating a rule of life. I know Deb brought her rule of life.
I did, because I have a friend who describes her rule of life as her trellis, which is a very gentle way, as opposed to rule or structure. A trellis that's a gentle thing that allows the beauty of the flowers and life to evolve. So this is my rule of life. I have spent many years trying to find the best kind for me, and this is called the Monk Manual, based on the Benedictines, but it helps me every single day to write things I'm grateful for, things that have caused unrest, way God is working in my life, how I want to do things differently, highlights, tasks, all of it, and it helps me focus on body, mind, spirit, and so it works for me.
And mine is taped to my desk. I don't like a lot of paper around, but I actually, as part of some therapeutic work that I was doing about 4 years ago, was part of a week-long retreat. The greatest challenge being no television, no newspapers, no magazines, and no cell phone or iPad for a week.
I thought you were going to say, and no talking for a week.
Oh, God, no, I would never do that. That was about as far as I would go. And that was challenging enough. But what was interesting about it was toward the end of that, we started creating, it was not called a rule of life, but that's really what it is. But it was also done in community with people that you had had these intense experiences with as you were doing some of this work. And so I brought it back, and it's taped to the inside of my desk so that I see it on a daily basis. But I think it's important to remind each other that the Benedictine, a simple Benedictine rule of life is that every day we begin again. And so it is about grace and about loving yourself and being gentle with oneself. And so, yeah, I was going to bring mine. I meant to grab it just because it's for me a gentle reminder, but it is about accountability for oneself, about who you are and who you want to be as you do
and
that.
how to do it that works for you.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing is, like, I think about it also each year, because Curry talks about in the new year is a good time, to do that.
Well, and he also says you should evaluate after a year. I mean,
Right.
I do. Every January 1st, I do.
And so a while back, I gave up doing New Year's resolutions, and I typically have a goal. And sometimes that's a focus word for the year, or it's a goal for the year that I want to achieve, that's something tangible and, things like that. It's not like world peace or solve hunger in Collier County, but it's something that I want to do for myself or, for my community or something. And that just changed my mindset. When you go from, I want to lose this much weight or I want to do this or do that, but to rather in a positive outlook. And I'm telling you, that just made all the difference in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. Before I close us out with some words from Curry himself, last words about what you learned about love in this book, or last things you want to say, Deb, in the Clergy Roundtable? It's all about love.
Wow. Well, I learned a lot from this book, and it's one of a few of the books that that I will take with me.
Yeah.
because it's one of those that's worthwhile. But what I would say is the best part of Clergy Roundtable is you, is doing it together, and you are, it takes a village, you're my village.
Yeah.
And I'm just so grateful for you and the ways our lives have intersected and the stories we tell each other, and I suspect we will continue to be friends.
I have no doubt of it.
I want those to be the last words.
Okay. And since I forgot the long passage that I was going to read.
I
and it
have
does-
it.
Is it too long to read?
No.
Okay. All right. These are words from Bishop Curry, imagining a world in which love is the way, title of his book. And I like this, so I encourage you to do as he asks. Stop and imagine for a minute. Think and imagine. Think and imagine a world where love is the way. Imagine our homes and families when love is the way. Imagine our neighborhoods and communities where love is the way. Imagine governments and nations where love is the way. Imagine business and commerce where love is the way. Imagine this tired old world when love is the way. When love is the way, unselfish, sacrificial, redemptive love. When love is the way, then no child will go to bed hungry in this world ever again. When love is the way, we will let justice roll down like a mighty stream and righteousness like an ever-flowing brook. When love is the way, poverty would become history. When love is the way, the earth will be a sanctuary. When love is the way, we will lay our swords and shields down by the riverside to study war no more. When love is the way, there's plenty of room for all of God's children. When love is the way, we actually treat each other, well, like we are actually family. May this be our prayer. Good night, and thank you.